I want to welcome two gentlemen who really don't need any further introduction. However, I do plan to start this by admonishing the audience that I will leave some time for Q&A at the end, and I simply will not tolerate a repeat of this morning's performance. You have two of the preeminent business leaders in the world, not just in the United States here, and so I'm sure you're going to want to ask questions that are better than mine toward the end of our time here. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I thought I would start with you, Dave. You have a thesis about the way that the work of the people in this room, the route that it should take to travel to senior management. I'd like you to share it, please.
Yeah, it'll probably bore everyone in the room again, but I do have a view that when you compare everything related to demand formation and how it is processed, turned into new products, the whole development cycle around new products, the introduction of those products, when you look at how information informs that half of the business, which I think Bob would agree is the most important half, and you compare and contrast it to the way information informs the supply chain, they're dramatically different. The engagement process is dramatically different, right? There's not a soul involved in the supply chain that doesn't have a number on their desk every day that tells them how it's going, how variation plays in, the cycle time. I'll bet Bob knew the minute something was late in the supply chain as things moved through it, right? And we always did in our business life. In the demand chain, we process all these inputs around what's changing, why it's changing. We oftentimes think about variation as bad instead of good. Variation in the demand world is a very important thing to understand because it just might represent something, a real potential, a real opportunity. Right?
Give your favorite example of of a variation in the demand chain.
Well, look, just in terms of the way media is consumed, right? That's the most obvious, and everyone here has a vested interest in it. But it probably wasn't lost on anyone. There was a moment in time where sort of the internet and the consumption of maybe long-form video on the internet or the amount of time that was spent engaged in social networking as compared to or as it relates to other media consumption was variation in the early days, small blips in variation. How early you understood that, how big you thought it might get, the potential about how it works with the existing medium. These are all things that are sort of buried inside these demand variation, right? So my whole premise is that most of the folks in this room know unbelievable amounts about that. The number of CEOs I know who actually are aware of what actually these guys boot around every day,
now,
it's on the tip of a pin.
Now, where I'm going to go with this in a moment is to gauge Bob's reaction and his appetite for such information. But I want to ask you first, Dave, why? Why is it not getting there? Is it because the CEOs don't give a damn, or because they're not, or what? Why is it?
First of all, the demand chain hasn't been talked about as a demand chain. So the half that was organized over the last 30 years to be thought about as a supply chain, nobody's actually stopped to think about that discipline now as a fully functioning chain. And then the other one is the information that feeds it doesn't come off an accounting system. And I know Bob's got a lot of views on that. Accounting systems balance every day. So there's no judgment involved in where the number comes from, right? It's the number. In the demand world, there is no accounting system, right? The current account doesn't exist. So there's judgment at every step along the way, right? Decisions have to be made. That's frustrating, it's slow, but it's also the upside, right? It's the chance to practice judgment. But you have to be informed. And so for me, it's a process that needs to be defined, and it can be defined differently in every company, doesn't matter, but it needs to be defined. And then as it's informed, there has to be a very, very robust discussion around decisions, and they have to get made rapidly.
All right, so Bob, put your hat on as an automotive executive. What's your appetite for this type of information and process?
I'll just back up a second and say, I think the reason so many CEOs in America are not great consumers of research data is for precisely the reasons that I mentioned in my book. Many of them come out of what I call the bean counter clan. So they rely on numbers that are supplied to them and are not terribly interested in shifting trends in the marketplace, attitude changes, desire changes, because all of these things are unquantifiable or seemingly unquantifiable and are not in the hard measurable world. Therefore, they don't like them. And kind of don't have an appetite for it because it doesn't fit their precisely defined, quantitatively defined paradigm. The second thing is, we all used to get from the General Motors research staff a list of monthly and quarterly studies that had been done by the research staff. And I'll tell you, it was like reading a Chicago telephone directory. I mean, there was so much money spent, and then it'd be stuff like diverging trends in 3-year-old used car values in the central Midwest region. You know, what CEO is going to say, oh, that sounds fascinating.
Going to take that one home and work with it tonight, right?
So there's, I think, a lot of probably useful, probably commissioned by somebody, a lot of research that was done, but is interesting to a small group who hopefully acts on it. I will say at GM, because it's unlike General Electric, which is this conglomerate of a zillion businesses, each with its own leader, it would be clear that the head of GE would not, I mean, he would assume that his CEOs process information about demand, attitude changes, trends, and so forth. But when you've got a monolithic company like an automobile company, like Ford or General Motors, or Chrysler, where the whole company is just one pyramid that ends at the top. There's a regular product development cycle, and how well your brand is doing and how well the next model is going to do is vital to the future of the company. Therefore, I will tell you, in the car business, the CEOs, chief financial officer, vice chairman, are vitally interested in the research results of new products. And I told you at lunch, Lee Iacocca had the idiosyncrasy. He was advertising manager at Ford division way back in the 60s something, and he took that job with him even to Chrysler. So when we had a new advertising campaign, Lee Iacocca as CEO personally reviewed the pre-testing.
Right. Now, what I hear you saying is that the CEO, the C-level executive in a large manufacturing company, is interested in research, but he or she is interested in good research or the right research, not the wrong research.
Yeah.
And is the problem here that they're not getting the right research?
No, I don't think that's the case. First of all, I think Bob's situation, experience in a car company is probably like mine in a jet engine world, which is you have products that you're well aware of are going to get introduced in defined intervals.
Right.
Yes.
And you got a cycle leading up to it where you can really do some hard work.
And you're referring to your General Electric background, which is why Bob was referencing
in
GE.
the world that this industry tends to feed, it's a very rapid paced, lots of product introductions, lots of innovations in existing products and brands that goes on all the time, right? It's all the time. So you don't have quite the prep time to sort of discern between good and bad. It's critical it be good and it be very sort of distinct and presented in a very simple format, right? That a CEO is incredibly confident in. We're nowhere near that stage by any stretch of the imagination.
So I know you made reference when we sat down that you've been singing this song for a while. Tell the people in the room what's going to enable them to take it to the next level. How do they get noticed by the Bob Lutzes of the world?
Yeah, well, them is us. So I'm in the center of this, right? So to be honest with you, the role that we have to define bigger than we do. Research, for me, is a word that is a very narrow, very domain-specific word that puts us in a place that it's not going to get that CEO level attention. We have to, who's going to define the demand chain for you and your world? You can use all the nomenclature you want around your brand and your company, but who's going to do it? and who is going to inform it? My view is our function or domain has to step up to that challenge. Because CEOs will want to talk about that. How do I think about the front end of my company differently? And is there a way to reorganize it, rethink it, so that information does play a bigger role? And I think companies are taking a stabs at it, but I think it can be informed and led. And I think the challenge for us in our industry is to do just that.
Now, having worked at most or all of the big auto companies, at least in the United States, right, Bob?
Are all very future product research focused, because if you get it wrong in the design or the size or the price category, and a lot of times you can use a technique which is disarmingly simple, but is a great indicator of how the product is going to do. You have your completed vehicle in fiberglass, but with chrome and glass and everything. Can't tell it's not real, in the presence of other people's real cars, and everybody is debadged, so that, because if they're not debadged, everybody immediately votes for the BMW and the Audi, and when you take the badges off, they don't. So that very interesting whole area for the academics to study is the value of brands and changing perception of
right.
it. But at any rate, if your car is in the clinic and then you ask people, what would you be prepared to pay for this? Where do you think it should be priced? If they say, if the average answer is 28 and you know you're going to price it at 21, you know that the customers are seeing more value than what you're charging, and you know you're going to have a hit. If the opposite is true, time to go back to the drawing board and redesign. So there is one major automobile company that is stumbling right now, and I talked to one of their marketing executives at the Detroit Auto Show, and I said, you guys are having a terrible design problem. Every one of your cars looks like it was done by a different company. There's no visual brand signature that ties it all together, and some of your cars are just plain ugly. I said, don't you do any product research? And he told me, he says, oh yeah, we do. 3 months before launch, we do a marketing clinic. And I said, well, okay, but how do you select the car that you're going to produce? I said, oh, our senior executives look at it. And then we call in some dealers, and we'll have 3 or 4 proposals, and we'll pick the best one. Well,
now, Bob, hang on one second.
That just doesn't work anymore.
For the anyone who's in the automotive industry knows exactly which company you're talking about, but we're not in the automotive industry.
Well, I'm very hesitant to divulge the name of the company, but there are only 3 large Japanese companies, two of whom are doing well, and one is doing not so well.
Okay, now, you know, book authors mentioned their book. You did it a moment ago. So I'll just point out that what's interesting to me about the example you just gave is that I just wrote a book about Apple. Apple was famous for saying, we don't care what customers want. We're going to give them the product that we want, what our senior management thinks we should give them. And that's precisely what you just described from this ailing Japanese automaker.
All right, but there's a difference. Steve Jobs is right, and that's what I always tried to do, was come up with something that is way beyond what the customer is expecting. Because if you had done research on the BlackBerry or on the iPhone and you asked cell phone users, what do you think of your cell phone? How should we modify it? What other features? You would have wound up with a slightly better cell phone. Mm-hmm. But the public can't envisage step function changes in product. That's the job of the creative people in automobile companies, just like Apple. So you've got to have this creative spark, this new big idea, and then phase 2, to make sure you're not talking to yourself and that you're not drunk on your own wine, then you research it. And if everybody says, what the hell? Who would buy that? And I've done a few of those, where in the research phase, everybody says, what was he thinking? And I've then had to go back and ask myself, what was I thinking? But the creative act has to come first, and I will absolutely would guarantee that once Steve Jobs had the idea for the iPad and the iPhone and said, that's what we're going to do, I am sure that prototypes were shown to focus groups and product clinics and so forth.
If they have been, I haven't found evidence of it, but I can't speak authoritatively to it.
Well,
I would like you to share with the room your thoughts on advertising, since although you didn't have Iacocca's background, you did approve advertising, and maybe talk about the research lessons behind the Jeep ad that you told us about at lunch.
Oh, well, during most of my time at Ford and at Chrysler and at GM earlier, advertising was very safe, and it was put through what I would call the research blanderizer, in that the ads in like storyboard form were shown to focus groups or groups of respondents, and people would say, well, I don't like the way the guy is picking up the dog. Okay, lose the dog. I think it's obnoxious the way the little kid is spraying his mother with the garden hose. Okay, let's take that out. And so that anything that was slightly edgy or slightly offensive got taken out. And finally, you'd wind up with an ad saying, the all-new Ford Escort, fuel economy, safety, and performance at a price you can afford. Now, there's a smash hit headline that everyone will retain for the rest of their lives. So, actually, I do remember that one, because at the end of the day, that was always the winning headline, where the guy said, here's what we're going to use. But yeah, while at Chrysler, we did the opposite. We had a very successful ad, which was a redo of The Hare and the Tortoise, and it was shot in the desert, and a great big desert tortoise, and the rabbit took off heading for this high butte a few miles away, and then the tortoise sort of one step at a time, and a guy shows up in a Jeep Wrangler, looks at the poor tortoise, picks it up, puts it on the passenger seat, straps it in, and goes bouncing up the rocks and gets to the butte before the rabbit, takes the tortoise and plops it on the ground. A quite effective ad, which nice redo of the Hare and the Tortoise story, demonstrated the capabilities of the Jeep Wrangler, had a lot of memorable features. And then we got all of the phone calls, letters, and I guess it was in the pre-email days, from the American Desert Tortoise Protection leagues about how we had relocated this tortoise against its will. And did we know that desert tortoises were so sensitive that even dropping them a few inches could cause serious internal injury? And no, the answer is no, we didn't know that. But had we had that massive protest ahead of time, probably we would not have run the ad.
Being a cautious company, afraid to offend people.
Well, this is the whole problem with a lot of business decision making, and I don't know whether it's because of the American legal environment, we're always afraid of getting sued, but we tend to err on the side of caution and finally take all of the appeal and all of the edginess and all of the attraction and all of the polarity out of something in order to be safe. And then you have a product which interests nobody.
So Dave, what's interesting about the story is that, and Bob's sort of going back and forth in his embrace or not of research, because here he's saying, had they done that, had they done some front-end research, they would have uncovered this outrage about the poor tortoise, and this wonderful, and I assume effective ad wouldn't have seen the light of day. So what's your reaction to that? How do you calibrate it?
Well, first of all, part of that is the big company syndrome, right?
Big company
syndrome,
yeah.
Where if you're, and I lived in one too, if you have a mass market and a big market, and you get something that it gets close to the edge, everybody wants to carve it down, you end up living in a world of averages. I'll bet most of the folks in this room probably deliver more averages to your senior teams than necessarily the edges. And I think in the advertising world and in a product development world, and I think you know the Apple story better than anybody, They like to live on the edges.
Yep.
And I think in today's day and age, living on the edge is not so bad.
No, it's
and,
good.
And research should highlight that fact. That if you get the edge and you hit it right, you're likely to have one of the bigger games in town, and it's going to become viral, and it will play out in a social way. And I think steering away from the edges is just a trap bigger companies get themselves into. And I think part of our objective ought to make sure we're always testing the edge, because I think there's more action there.
Yep.
So you personally did not grow up in the media research world, and you also, none of us here grew up in the social media world because it's so new. Would you comment on what impact social media is having on research?
Well, it's,
and on media?
Well, I think half the discussions out here,
Yeah.
this crowd revolve around it, and they're always the best attended, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. I think it's the sky's the limit, honestly, with social networking, mostly based on what you can learn from it, right? It's the challenge for all of us is how to listen to it, right? What really is emerging, what isn't? Where are the demand interests really lie? I think hunting the social networking world for those kinds of answers to then inform the technology people and the product development people inside companies is just about as leading edge as it gets. I also think there is a huge supply chain dynamic that's going to get played out in social networking. And what that is demand's going to shape, form, and then it's going to subside in very rapid order, because that's what happens in the social networking world. So we talk about brands that made it viral and got big quick. That's wonderful when it happens, but there were a whole lot of brands that got small quick in that same moment.
After having a spike, you mean?
After having a spike. So the question becomes, if we're going to live in a virally fed advertising world, there's an up and there's a down, and supply chains are going to have to learn how to, be incredibly flexible in dealing with that. So the ramifications of social networking, demand formation in there, therein, I just think they're huge. I think they're huge.
And are you paying attention to this, Bob?
Well, it was just really starting to go when I left General Motors in the middle of 2010, and before that I had been in charge of marketing during 2009, and we were just getting really geared up to do the social networking thing, and because of the decline in effectiveness of traditional television and print advertising. Where it is right now, for instance, at a company like GM, I can't tell you. All I do know is you do read occasional articles in Automotive News, which is sort of the weekly trade paper for the automobile business and its dealers and suppliers. But I think most automobile companies, because it is such a major purchase, are finding it difficult to use social networking as a vehicle for driving demand. And that's why you're still seeing a lot of television spots, despite the difficulty today. Although there are kind of computer algorithms to select channels and times to get your target audiences. But despite the multiplicity of channels and the expense of TV advertising, right now for the car business, for a high-end, consumer durable, I would say television advertising still trumps the social media when it comes to car advertising.
Just to maybe intrigue Bob, so I'm involved in a couple of other companies that have learned about social networks in a very interesting way. So at Caterpillar, there are operators who sit on our equipment all day long, every day, 5, 6 days a week. They form their own networks, right? Never mind Cat might have invited them or not. They got their own network. And guess what they talk about? What they like, what they don't like, what happened with respect to the performance of that equipment. Now, for a company like Cat who has to do their forms of research, what you do for an ear into that conversation is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Train operators, it's the same thing. So it's not only as it relates to consumers. Everybody in their day jobs, if they have a common interest and do common things, they're also involved in networks and they create communities. And what you can pick from that, I guarantee you Bob would have been listening to those guys.
Yeah, well, because when you've got something like the Caterpillar equipment operator, that is clearly such I would say, a non-diverse, almost monolithic group of specialists that clearly their voice is extremely, and I suppose because that is your user base and it's narrowly defined. It's a little bit like Alan Mulally when he was at Boeing listening to airline operators and pilots. The problem with the automobile business is the audience for passenger cars is so diffuse, so many different socioeconomic groups, that so many different user profiles, and then a whole bunch of people who buy. See, the thing is with the Caterpillar guys, I just thought what the operative thing is. These people have bought this piece of equipment not for emotional reasons, they've bought it for functional reasons, and it better function as advertised, otherwise you'd better know about it. Very few automobile buyers actually buy a car for functional reasons. They buy it for social reasons, aesthetic reasons. What will my friends say?
And you know this presumably from asking them, right?
Sir?
You know this from asking them. You know why they buy because you've done research on it.
Oh yeah, well that's very legitimate research. I mean, one of the things we're always looking at, any automobile company looks at, is the content of the meaning of its brand. Mm-hmm. And that's where the American car companies over the last 30 years have done a relatively poor job, which is why Lincoln and Cadillac, which used to be highly prestigious makes, are having to fight their way back against companies where you don't have to explain why you bought one. But successfully managed brands have a great deal of emotional content, which is one of the prime reasons people buy them. So getting feedback from, say, the chronic BMW buyer has nothing.
You described that as a medical condition.
Well, they have
almost.
nothing. It has nothing. I like the cars, but they run like anybody else's. They consume fuel like anybody else's. You ask the average country club housewife why she has a BMW X5. She says, because I would be embarrassed to show up at the country club with anything else.
Yeah.
That's and when you start pumping all of that in, it's much more difficult than your Caterpillar yellow equipment operator.
Let's talk briefly about another emotional issue that is near and dear to your heart, and that is the Chevy Volt.
One of my favorite subjects.
So the Volt is kind of like Apple. There's never a slow news week on the Chevy Volt.
That's right.
And so a lot has happened even since you've left General Motors full time. Explain briefly from your perspective the short and interesting history of the Chevy Volt and what your prediction for it is.
All right. Well, the Chevy Volt is the technologically most advanced automobile of all time. It's the only car in the world that can do 40 miles electrically and then another 250 miles with the small gasoline engine acting as a generator, so it's always electric. Most owners average between 175 and 250 miles per gallon. It was named Car of the Year in the United States. It was just named Car of the Year in Europe. First time any American car has been named Car of the Year in Europe, by the way. So it's a technological leap, soon to be joined by similar vehicles from Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, Mercedes, et cetera, but GM did have a 3-year lead on this technology. Problem was the Rush Limbaugh and the talking head extreme right, and I have to quickly identify myself as a conservative here, but Limbaugh, Lou Dobbs, Bill O'Reilly, Neil Caputo, all of these guys started identifying the Chevy Volt as a symbol of Obama interventionism in the automobile industry. Last time I checked, Obama was elected in 2008. We started working on the Volt in 2006. We had a prototype at the Detroit Auto Show in January of 2007. So it was well along the way. Then along came a fortuitous event for the detractors. Oh, and then they said, and this vehicle is so ridiculous, it's so expensive, and it only goes 40 miles. There was another fiction. It only goes 40 miles. What's his name? David Letterman was on that one too. And it's so ridiculous that the U.S. government, which forced General Motors to make this thing, now has to provide $7,500 of tax credits to induce you to buy it. Never once mentioning that the $7,500 doesn't apply to the Volt, it applies to any electrified vehicle, and those tax credits were enacted under George W. Bush. Obama had nothing to do with them. So then we have a government crash test, side impact pull test, which basically folds the car in half. The battery was damaged. After the car didn't roll over, but then it was rolled on its back for 5 minutes and on its two sides for 5 minutes each, during which time some fluid leaked, which caused the battery to catch fire 3 weeks after the crash. Which, assuming anybody had survived the crash, you'd think 3 weeks is sufficient time to exit the vehicle. And that became the Chevrolet Volt catches fire. And Lou Dobbs and Bill O'Reilly were on one evening. He says, yeah, they all catch fire. Yeah, they're recalling them all because they all catch fire. Never should have built it in the first place. Another typical example of what happens when the government meddles in business and so forth. I mean, I've been carefully taught not to, by the Forbes blog I do, every time I use the word lie, they say, don't say that, because lying implies intent. You have to say misinformation, which is more factual. So don't get yourself sued, don't say lie. So I deliberately don't say lie, but what we are...
That's a very thorough explanation of why not to use that word, lie.
What we are seeing here is systematic disinformation about a company's product, not for the purpose of damaging the company, but for damaging the President of the United States. And as I say, I'm a card-carrying Republican, but this bothers me.
So let's...
But the Volt will, bottom line, the Volt will be fine.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. Let's fast forward. At the current moment, the car's production is suspended temporarily.
Yeah.
And
this really helps the American worker. You know, these guys are all for USA first. Protect American jobs, stop sending stuff to China.
Yeah.
And what they do is with their propaganda, they cause a 5-week layoff of American workers in Hamtramck, Michigan. Really angers me. But so the car started off very fast, has had this dip, is now recovering. We think March is going to be a record Volt month. And exports to Europe have started, and I just read in the GM clip sheets, they have, before it's even hit the ground in Europe, they have 8,000 sold customer orders.
So I want to, given that this is an advertising-oriented audience, and this is very clearly a matter of public perception. That's what this debate is in the debate of public perception. How will General Motors, is it just going to be steady as she goes and sort of hope that there will be no more misinformation, or do you have to put your thumb on the scale a little bit?
This is my gripe, frankly, and GM knows it. This is my gripe with the way it was handled, which was, let's not prolong a bad story. Let's not argue. Let's not fight back. This is a one-day story, which clearly it wasn't.
Right.
It's going to go away. If we fight back, it'll only make it bigger. If I had been there, I would have hit the internet every way possible. I would have done blogs about, here is the truth of on the Chevrolet Volt, with an official blog by GM senior management. I would have taken full-page ads in the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, LA Times. I mean, all the big ones.
You would have fought back hard.
Full-page print ads saying, here's the truth about the Chevrolet Volt.
And the problem is that the haters would have said that you're using the company that the funds of the company that the government owns 27% of to fund that
Yeah, you
ad
probably
campaign
can't win.
to satisfy the president's agenda. But Dave, you wanted to say something.
No, I just, the perfect analogy to this one was, I don't know if you remember David Novak at Yum Brands, and the Taco Bell got hit with the sort of, you don't have, USA grade beef or whatever.
Yep.
And he did precisely what Bob recommended. And he ran the full page ad the next day going, you don't know what you're talking about, because it turned out some independent test lab actually had sort of conjured up results that weren't really representative of what reality was. So they took it on, but he had a pretty significant social networking user base that was already a community.
Yeah.
And so he could tap that community at the same time he put the message out, and actually, in my view, in retrospect, won that war, and won it quickly.
Yeah.
You got to go, if the war is there, you got to get to war quick to get to peace.
I agree.
And I think there's a big lesson for the folks.
And to make I assume, to make a segue here, I assume that Yum had an understanding of its community and of its social network, what
Totally.
it had at its disposal.
Exactly. So, and I do think a lot of consumer-oriented companies have leaned heavily into this, and they do have communities, and they have formed them. I think the durable world, it takes longer. It's and it's not quite as pervasive as it probably could be.
Quite right.
So before we get to the questions that I know that the people in this room are just dying to ask, the two of you, I want to ask you, Dave, to react to something that you and I have been talking about for a little while. One of the unusual things about Apple is that it is so functional. It's not a divisionalized company. General Electric is the ultimate divisionalized company, and yet General Electric recently said that it's going to try to emphasize deep expertise and stop moving its senior people around quite so much, or at least letting them stay longer. I just wanted to get your take on that, and then Bob's take on it.
Yeah, my own view is that, and let's start with sort of Bob's description of GE, which really is a series of big Fortune 100 companies that happens to have a span breaker at the top, right?
Yeah.
In those individual companies, believe it or not, domain expertise is treasured. So the functions in the jet engine business, engineers rule the day, and they should.
And they stay for a long time.
All day, and you reward them like crazy, and you get them to be the chief engineer, and you have chief technology officer. You do those kinds of things for that crowd. But for the individuals running that business, they would, in fact, bring people in from other industries. It could have been energy, it could have been other infrastructure businesses. They bring them in, and the hope is that the adjacent industry lessons they learn, right? Because they were in a different environment, facing different obstacles, having to deal with different environments, they would create practices having to deal with that could be then implemented in an industry not facing those issues and ultimately make it better. I happen to think that model is phenomenal. I really do. And I'm not objective about it, but I will say that most of the great practices that were implemented during the long tenures that I had there came from adjacent industries. It hardly ever came from studying your direct face-to-face competitor because your strategies were so damn similar. I mean, you were moving, centimeters when you were just fighting the fight all day with your. But when you looked to an adjacent industry dealing in a different environment, you could learn big stuff.
Interesting.
Big stuff.
So I don't know what the right word is to use, but there's no doubt that GE has signaled it's not that they're abandoning this, but it's they're lessening the commitment to it.
It's the pendulum. And look, I think Jeff is spectacular.
Jeff Immelt, the CEO.
I applaud it. The domain experts that will run big businesses there will be great at what they do. And then what he'll do to infiltrate it with out-of-industry experience, he'll create councils. He'll do other things to give that domain expert and challenge that domain expert to think outside the box, right? So there are other ways to accomplish it.
Bob?
Well, I think unlike General Electric, car companies are one gigantic pyramid that comes to a C-suite top, and there isn't a portfolio of companies, so it's all one organization. But still, you're always facing this question of generalist versus functional specialist.
Right.
And like the jet engine business, in engine engineering, for instance, you don't want to move a bunch of engineers in and out of engine engineering, except maybe the occasional outside hire to leaven the mix a little bit and bring some new thinking and new ideas. But when you get to the senior management level, like vice presidents, and I know Dan Ackerson believes in this very deeply, you do want to move them around, because nothing is worse for an automobile company than to have somebody out of one functional specialty in which he or she has been their whole careers and then become CEO, because their bias will forever be with that function. Like a head of manufacturing who becomes CEO will always bias all decision making and always towards manufacturing, which is completely the wrong direction. And I think at a senior management level, you do want people to have the whole picture. And for instance, Mary Barra, who succeeded me in product development, came out of human resources, put in as head of product development, and everybody said, how is this supposed to work? Well, it's working extremely well. Fortunately, when I was put into product development, nobody said, why are they putting a marketing guy in charge of product development? Because the history out there is that I'm an engineer. So, even though I'm not, so that seemed logical. So for Mary, it took a lot of listening and a lot of work, but now she's doing fine. I think this, again, you need the functional expertise, otherwise the work no longer gets done. But when you get to the senior leadership, I think generalism is better.
We have time for one question. But I don't see the hand up.
There is one over there.
You have a question here. I don't want to disappoint
Please
you.
identify yourself.
Yeah, my name's Richard Zakon, Council for Research Excellence. And the title of this session is about collaboration, and the topic of the edge came up. So I'm wondering if either of the gentlemen can speak to how collaborative work leads to the edge rather than to the average.
How collaborative work leads to the edge.
Well, I can address it in a subject that I happen to love. Collaboration, I'll use another word, alignment. We have in this crowd folks who are crazy about analyzing the shopper and the shopper's behavior. We have a crowd here that's just crazy about analyzing the consumer and the sort of the needs that consumers are trying to satisfy. And we got a crowd here that is totally focused on the programming and content that the audience wants to see in their life. And interestingly, the target of all of those is exactly the same person, right? It's one person who happens to be a shopper, happens to be a consumer, and happens to be audience. Well, the alignment of all of those interests, in my view, represents the single biggest demand chain opportunity that we have, such that what happens at the retailer is perfectly aligned and coordinated with what the manufacturer is trying to accomplish with the brand. And the folks who are building content and audience can get as close to a perfect match with the audience on a given show or at a given time of day to that same target, right? In other words, the alignment. And that's what reinforces messaging. That's what ultimately gets you the most value. So that level of collaboration, I think we all take shots at it. I think the research industry has the key to unlocking collaboration. It can, in fact, begin to create the alignment mechanics. Edge. I still have a view, and I think alignment is critical to getting it, that in the consumer world, defining what we do in terms of our products is going to increasingly become sort of antiquated. It's not going to be a sort of, it's not in any, it doesn't motivate anybody, including the ultimate target. Talking about what we do as satisfying need states does, right? Need states get developed, they get formed in social networking and neighborhoods and so forth, and then people try to satisfy those need states, right? And if we can align ourselves around that, and by the way, satisfying a need state requires edge. It just does. You have to be out there satisfying precisely what that emotional appeal is right that moment. If you get that right, you've got all the pricing power you could ever want. Right? It's easy to imagine sort of those end games. And so for me, that's sort of the case study on edge and collaboration. I use a different word, but in effect, that's what that is. And I think that is a little bit about what this demand world is going to require from all the participants.
So Dave, with that eloquent answer, I think I'll say thank you to both of you gentlemen, and thank you very much for a stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Good.